the US-backed blockade. We talked about Palestinian and non-Palestinian students together being in solidarity to try to fight back against the Zionist backlash against Palestinian students and organizers here on campus. Talk about Filipino students, youth and students, who are fighting for national democracy and for education that actually meets their economic and cultural needs here in the US. What do all these have in common? There's actually a lot when we talked about it. And so the big thing that we started to think of is, what does it mean to be in solidarity with a movement, with a people, with a country, with people all around the world? That's a word that gets thrown out around a lot, am I right? You know, a lot of different people would use that word, sometimes in very good intentions, sometimes in kind of mischievous intentions. But really what it comes down to is that if we are going to work together, if we are going to fight back against whatever forces are causing a shared form of oppression, we need to find a shared form of struggle in some way, shape, or form. So that's what led us to want to put on this panel to pose that question. What is international solidarity? We might not all face oppression the same way. We might not all take part in struggle against oppression the same way. But there are those convergence points that we can find. And right here on PSU campus there's a strong basis to build a movement for international solidarity. So I guess without further ado, let's start off answering that question. I'm going to pass it off to Stella first to talk on behalf of the Cuba Solidarity Club on how she starts to answer that question. So take it away.
Okay. Hello again. With Cuba, I think an important place to start is just the island nation's experience with imperialism. And imperialism in this case would be not nations like Spain and the US reaching out in solidarity and support for Cuban people, but those countries actually exploiting, using, and abusing the people of Cuba. That began with the Spanish colonization of Cuba in 1511, and Cuba did not gain independence from Spain until 1898, so a lot of years of struggle for Cuba. Independence from Spain kind of went immediately into a form of neocolonialism at the hands of the US. So for the following 60 years after independence, Cuba was controlled by various US-backed, first it was just actual US officials, people who were just of the US government who were like, I'm your interim leader, this is what we're gonna do. And then we kind of transitioned into US-backed dictators. I think Batista would be probably the most recognizable name that people would be familiar with. And during that time, the US used Cuba for a variety of things. One of the biggest things was sugar, so kind of just having big sugar plantations, taking all of the sugar and the profits from the production of sugar, and then, just using that to make money while Cubans were the ones working on these plantations. None of that money was going into kind of infrastructure, things that people living there would need. It's just a typical neocolonial relationship where all of those resources are leaving. So it was a really big deal when the Cuban Revolution came about, which had a lot of leaders over a long period of time, but it was under the leadership of Fidel Castro and Che Guevara that finally, in 1959, Cuban independence was actually achieved. So there was the initial independence from Spain, and then there was the independence from all imperial oppression, kind of. And that's the ongoing Cuban Revolution that we still see today. So Cuba is still a sovereign nation, though it faces a lot of struggle, mostly at the hands of the US. So the following 60 years since the Cuban Revolution up until today have seen basically unmitigated imperialist aggression, mostly at the hands of the US, which comes in the form of various attempted coups, sanctions, blacklisting, and propagandistic smears. ongoing sanctions are probably the most important thing to talk about right now, because that is the form of like soft power that the US uses to keep Cuba down. The embargo in Cuba is actually the most enduring embargo in modern history. So it's lasted for 60 years now. It's actually been strengthened recently, and that prevents Cuba from having basically normal trade relations with other countries. So we live in a really globalized world, and people are aware of that. Like, all countries are kind of needing to share in trade resources. You know, everything comes from everywhere, but Cuba is really largely cut off from a lot of the opportunity to work with even just other nations in the Caribbean, as well as nations far away. And that's because of the United States. It's called the blockade, and that's because of just like the level of aggression, but it's kind of a metaphor for basically just an extremely oppressive regime of sanctions that has been placed on Cuba. And the initial sanctions, or the initial like bill ordering sanctions on Cuba, was 1 year after Cuba had its revolution, and that was written into law by the Kennedy administration. And we have just a quote that I think is really relevant still today from the Kennedy administration during that time was, "These sanctions are to bring about hunger, desperation, and overthrow the government." So we're not really like messing around here. It's pretty clear what the intention of that is. It's not necessarily just to target the government and deal with that. It's to make sure that people are put in a state of desperation where they need change in their government. More recently, Cuba was added to the US's list of state sponsors of terrorism in 2021, which it occupies with, I think it's just Syria, it's like 4 other countries, so it's like a really small list, and basically that just makes it gives more legal precedence for blocking off Cuba with these sanctions. The UN has voted for 29 years in a row to condemn these sanctions, with 185 countries that have said you need to lift these, they're completely inhumane, they're killing people, it's totally oppressive, and the US and Israel are the only 2 countries that have continually shut down that vote. And so it kind of gives us a clue of like how much power the US has in the world, and then also its relationship with Israel, which is, we'll get into more later. This is a picture of like the people of Cuba. So these are the people that these sanctions are impacting. It's not, you know, I guess that's all you really need to see or say is there are human beings living here, and they don't have access to food and medicine and all the basic things that every human needs because of these sanctions. And then I'm running a little low on time, but I wanted to talk about what the opposite of imperialism would be. And just look at like what Cuba has done in terms of internationalism. And the medical brigades are a really good example of that. From the dawn of its revolution in '59, Cuba has had free public health care. So that was written into the Constitution. That was like an immediate goal for Cuba, was to make sure that people were taken care of. And just in the following year, 1960, it was already sending medical brigades to go and help other people who didn't have access to what we would consider basic human rights. So the very first brigade went to Chile to go help people after the earthquake. And a little bit more on that. I just have like a few different examples of where that's happened. Cuba went to Algeria to help, basically like as African nations were becoming decolonized, achieving independence, Cuba was there to help set up some sort of infrastructure that would be people serving. So that happened in Algeria. They helped out in Venezuela as well, obviously in Latin America, not in Africa, with the Bolivarian Revolution. And that's been an ongoing relationship of like getting better prices on oil and helping with medicine, and that's just one example of like how things could be if Cuba were really allowed to interact with its neighbors and with other nations. Cuba served West Africa during the Ebola outbreak in 2014 and 16, and it also has ELAM, which is the Latin American School of Medicine, which trains doctors and nurses free of charge. It started out in Cuba, and it actually has extended to graduate students from 105 countries. That includes the US. So if you want to be a doctor and it's just ridiculous here, you can go to Cuba and you can be a doctor and you can help serve in that way, which is pretty amazing. There's a cool quote that I found when I was researching more about this. That was the WHO, the World Health Organization director, Margaret Chan. She was the director in 2009. Was speaking of ELAM, she was saying, "For once, if you are poor, female, or from an indigenous population, you have a distinct advantage in admission. This is an institutional ethic that makes this medical school unique." And ELAM boasts like really high numbers of women, indigenous people, people of color as doctors, and that definitely stands apart when you think about the medical world at large. The Henry Reeve Brigade was assembled to aid the US, this is another medical brigade, after Hurricane Katrina, which devastated the South, left a lot of people dead, homeless, in need of medical care. We don't have good health care here. You can imagine what that looked like for people. I actually had family that was there during that time. And Cuba assembled a brigade called the Henry Reeve Brigade in honor of a US-born general who had assisted Cuba in their independence from Spain. And when they proposed to come and help us out, it was the Bush administration at the time, just completely ignored it, dismissed it, and actually didn't include that extension of solidarity in their official report of like countries that have offered to help us during this time. But Cuba was like, well, we've got all these doctors and we're ready. So they went instead to Guatemala and helped out there. They then went to Pakistan and onward to Haiti. So that talent and that generosity was not squandered. Another important thing I would like to touch on is Cuba's fight against apartheid in Angola. That was an incredible display of solidarity. Angola at that time was newly independent. This is like 1970s. And apartheid South Africa was threatening to invade, had actually started invading, and Cuba was the only country to reach out with like physical troops, military support to fight off apartheid South Africa and keep a white supremacist regime from taking over Angola. And yeah, here's a picture. We've got Fidel and Nelson Mandela. We have just pictures of the troops. And they were actually successful in fighting off apartheid South Africa, which is pretty amazing. The final victorious operation was called Operation Carlota, and that was named after a woman who'd been enslaved in Angola on a plantation and took up arms with her machete and was killed in that struggle. And so they named that operation in honor of her memory and her struggle. So I will leave that there and hand it over to Hannah. Oh, that's fancy way.
All right, thank you so much, Stella. I don't know if I'm supposed to thank you, but thank you. That was like I introduced myself earlier, my name's Hannah. I'm with Super. We're on the first slide. Cool. So yeah, we are a student-led organization dedicated to raising awarenesses about the injustices concerning the occupation of the Palestinian people. And so today I just wanted to before we talk about Palestine, to really understand the conditions of it, it's important to understand how imperialism has shaped the region of the Middle East and how it led to the conditions that established the State of Israel. And then more so to understand how the State of Israel uniquely functions, which is the system of settler colonialism that can only exist because of imperialism. So I wanted to be able to go through that information today and give y'all a little bit of a situation of what's happening. Cool. So before the Israeli occupation of Palestine, understanding the British mandate in the Zionist movement, to understand first, like, what is the State of Israel built on that is occupying Palestine? It is built upon the ideology of Zionism. This was an idea that was created in the late 1800s in response to European anti-Semitism. Theodor Herzl, considered the father of Zionism, really took this idea and put it into action by promoting it to colonial empires such as Britain, as this is an idea that they should invest in and help establish. And so the idea of Zionism is the creation of an exclusively Jewish nation state to be established in Palestine, regardless that there is already indigenous Palestinians living there. The reason for Palestine is because the religious significance that it has to Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. And so the reason that they appealed to Britain is because Palestine was under British occupation. So after World War I, two generals from Britain and France, Sykes, I think it's like Sir Sykes and Sir Picot, had just taken a map of the Middle East and drew their own borders into what we now know as Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq, Palestine, and Jordan, and carved it up and split it up between the British and the French. And so that's why Theodore Herzl appealed to the British for the control, to lend them the control of Palestine. And the reason why Britain had actually decided, under 1917 came the Balfour Declaration, in which they gave word saying, we give permission to this growing Zionist movement to establish a Jewish homeland in Palestine, was because the Zionist movement had promised them that, that this was not going to be separate from British interests, meaning Britain would still have a direct control of Palestine, but it will now be done instead through this new nation state, this new project of people. It's because at this time, British occupation wasn't British people coming and living in Palestine. It was their military bases being set up, but they saw that that was not going to be effective long term. They needed a more permanent solution, and a more permanent solution is settlers, people being on the ground in a process of controlling and subjugating the indigenous population. So from this, we can loosely think of Zionism, political Zionism, as the ideology that justifies the existence of the state of Israel at the direct expense of the Palestinian people, as well as the belief in the necessity for this state to be maintained in direct opposition to Palestinian freedom, sovereignty, and independence. And so look at it, this begun now the process of settler colonialism. And just to kind of paraphrase this, what I have up here, settler colonialism differs a little bit than colonialism because it's not about viewing the indigenous people as dispensability. They're not looking to necessarily exploit their labor directly or to have them there as a permanent, class to oppress. They need to aim for the project of eliminating the indigenous people. And so settler colonialism, the qualities of that looks like conquest, not migration. Settlers are not coming to look and simply just settle in Palestine. They're looking to take over Palestine, which means taking over Palestinian land, Palestinian homes, Palestinian villages and towns. They're not looking to participate or specifically take over the indigenous economy. They're looking to replace it by establishing their own economy. Oh, cool, okay, 5 minutes, cool, I'll try to rush through. Which also was, the settler economy was only developed by British funding. Britain had continuously put investments and money, so settlers that were beginning to settle and begin to create the firsts of Israel could have, their own economy to outdo the Palestinian economy and their livelihoods. And so this begins to lead us into then their next step of like a logic of elimination, which, the logic of elimination is a classic mentality of all settler colonial projects, which must be done through confrontation, incarceration, and assimilation. And so in 1948, a Nakba represents the major event of mass ethnic cleansing of 700,000 Palestinians, massacring over 13,000 Palestinians, that officially establishes what is now known as the State of Israel. So this was, paramilitaries, Zionist paramilitaries that were armed with British weapons, French weapons, moving in overnight and ethnically cleansing over 500 villages. And so many of these villages, many Palestinians actually fled under threat of massacres, coming up into Leading up to 1948, many of these paramilitaries had committed atrocious massacres. I'm not going to touch on it today, but Dadiasian was a major one that I know even my family, that was the massacre that had led actually my entire family to pick up everything they had and walk overnight from, I don't know map this, but from Jaffa to the West Bank and then later to Jordan. And so this is, from the Zionist narrative, this is known as their Independence Day. This is like Zionist, the same day that we actually celebrate, like May 15th and Nakba Day, the mass catastrophe, is what the state of Israel celebrates as like their day of independence. And for them, they see this as this was needed for the safety of Jewish people and that there was no other option, this had to be done. Because under their ideology, that there's a necessity to develop a Jewish ethno-state at the expense of indigenous people, of course to them this was the only option. And so I just want to kind of provide that visual of like 1917, beginning with under British occupation, British imperialism. Cool. Oh, cool. Okay. Under British imperialism, you begin to see kind of over here on this side, a few settlements begin to kind of make their way into Palestine, beginning to establish that. This was actually when there was only, the settler population only made like 7, or actually it was like less than 3%, but they controlled 7% of the land at this point, purely because of Britain helping them establish that control of land. Leading up into 1948, you begin to see, the movement of settlers beginning to establish more of their homes through massacres, through force. And then proceeding up until from 1948 to 1967, this huge jump of settlements they begin to see is due to al-Nakba. So this image right here of 1948 is just like the same year. This is where the settler population was at, right before al-Nakba. 1967 was where it was. So you begin to see how drastic of an effect of those Zionist militaries kind of begin moving in and ethnically cleansing Palestinians. And then today you see that majority of Palestine is occupied under the state of Israel. What is left, and not under Palestinian control, but is the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. In the West Bank, of course, there's continuous settlements being built in it because the end goal of the state of Israel, of settler colonialism, has to be the complete and total termination and replacement of the indigenous people. And so I'll kind of just show, like, this is, as we talked about, Nakba was this mass event, but to Palestinians in our analysis, how we see it, it wasn't just a one-time event. That was the beginning of an ongoing structure that continues today. The same tactics, structures, everything used in Nakba is what happens today, because it is ongoing settler colonialism through home demolitions, land theft, Palestinian diaspora. If you are born in exile, you are refused entry onto your own ancestral lands, but any non-Palestinian can go and settle in Palestine. You can live in my grandmother's home, even though I have no entry or access to it. Mass incarceration, massacres, and occupation raids. Many times the militaries, the occupation forces at the break of dawn will storm a refugee camp, specifically targeting it because there is people defending the refugee camp. Palestinians defending their homes. Okay. And we'll go through this, and then so that is settler colonialism, that continuous expansion of land and extermination of people, of Palestinians, is maintained through apartheid, which is a system of segregation. This is the way they maintain control of the structure of Israel to refuse movement of Palestinians. And this is, I just want to kind of maybe, I don't know how much of you have seen the news lately. It's rare if you see Palestine in any kind of American news outlets, but the recent raids in the Al-Aqsa Mosque, because it's Ramadan, is why the occupation forces are specifically trying to restrict Palestinians from being able to enter it. As even American news outlets can't deny, but show something of it, because that's how brutal the violence has been, and that's how and how much anger there is even internationally from the people. And then, in terms of continuing the ongoing Nakba, kind of similar to the sanctions that Cuba is under, there's a blockade on Gaza from the state of Israel, purposely to collectively punish a whole people for refusing to concede to Zionism and continuing to resist by any means necessary. The Gaza blockade means no one is able to leave and no one's able to come into the Gaza. You can't rebuild your home if it is destroyed. You almost like 90% of the population is unemployed. You can't fish, you can't farm. There's no possibility of an economy. You can't trade and you can't leave. And Gaza is specifically targeted for bombing campaigns, meaning it's the world's biggest open air prisons that is constantly bombed by the state of Israel and is used to collectively punish a people. And so, yeah, we'll just go. So, yeah, so just kind of what you need to know to understand the conditions of Palestine, what Palestinians are going through in the case of how imperialism affects it. It is indigenous people fighting for their land and lives. They're fighting against a US-backed, right now, everything I talked about, those home demolitions, land theft, bombing campaigns, $3.6 billion of US military aid goes to provide all of that. Every single bit of it is like an itemized US bill. And so Palestinian struggle is against a Zionist movement that is purely funded and backed by the US. And so now I'll hand it to Tiff to talk about the Philippines. Sorry. That I took long.
Yeah, thanks again for being here, y'all. If you just kind of walked in, there is a sign-in sheet in the front. We'd love to have your contact info. Sir was raising his hand over here in the corner. And there's also some snacks and drinks in the back, so please feel free to help yourself. And there's some tables in the back, too, that you can talk to from the organizations we represent. But anyways, I'm Tiff. I'm a part of Anakbayan Portland. Which Anakbayan means Youth of the Nation in Tagalog. And we are an overseas organization that is not in solidarity, but an extension of Anakbayan Philippines that is part of the youth and student sector, with our main task to organize the people here in the belly of the beast, but also abroad in the Philippines to overthrow the three problems and to fight for national democracy with a socialist perspective. We can go to the next slide. Kind of similar to Cuba's history, the Philippines has been a colony of Spain for over 300 years, super long time. And it wasn't until the revolution of 1896 where we've had the Philippines actually oust Spain. If you go to the next slide, it was from the Treaty of Paris in 1898 where countries like the Philippines, Cuba, Guam, Puerto Rico, all were sold from Spain to the US. Yes, and the Philippines was sold to the US for $20 million. And since that, the Philippines has had installments of puppet presidents backed by the US. I'm going to talk more about modern day militarization in the Philippines, especially a lot of these developments have happened in the last few weeks. So EDCA, which is the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, allows for the creation and the use of military facilities by US troops in the Philippines. And in February 2023, the Philippines actually agreed to add 4 more bases under it, so bringing it to a total of 9 US bases. So if you can see here, it's all across the island chain. And strategically, it's all pointed towards China, right? EDCA allows U.S. forces to participate with the Philippines in like security cooperation exercises, joint and combined military training activities, and humanitarian aid. And actually, if we go to the next slide, this is happening in April all the way to the 28th, which is actually the anniversary of EDCA. The Balikatan exercises. Balikatan actually translates shoulder to shoulder in Tagalog, so that friendship we have there. It is actually the largest military training this year, which includes 12,000 US troops, 5,000 Filipino troops, and over 100 Australian troops, along with observers from Japan participating in this training. And this is all, again, the US's way to build up unnecessary provoking against China, and just putting the people of the Philippines in between two superpowers. We go to the next. And the impact of the US military has in places like the Philippines, we have what is called the Visiting Forces Agreement, which protects US military, and DoD, which stands for Department of Defense Civilians Personnel in the Philippines. Here we have Jennifer Laude. She was a transgender Filipina that was killed by Joseph Pemberton, and he was pardoned actually for his crime of killing her. So we see that these unequal treaties between the US and the Philippines are a threat to the safety and well-being of Filipino women. Yeah, and lining all of that up, meanwhile we have President Bongbong Marcos Jr., who is trying to pass for a constitution amendment, charter change, which in the Philippines they call it cha-cha for short. And its basis for this constitution amendment is to change the economic provisions in order to make the Philippines more globally competitive and attuned with the changing times. What that actually means is just inviting foreign investors to come into the Philippines to be sold, for its land to be extracted, its resources to displace people. And we know that this foreign investment is actually not to facilitate pro-people economic development. The Philippines is export-oriented, import-dependent economy, which means a lot of our raw materials, which we have tons of them, including lithium, is constantly being exported because we do not have a national industry to process it ourselves. And so we export our raw materials and get processed materials back at a much larger price. Oh, perfect. So, yeah, with that, we know that there has been resistance against the fascist government of Bongbong Marcos Jr. And US imperialism. We know that while the US wants to provoke China, this will only raise tensions and trigger an endless arms race between the US and China, where the Philippines is caught between these two opposing countries. And in the presence of armed forces, local or foreign, they have always brought gender-based violence, accelerated climate disasters. War is the highest form of violence on the people, and the military is the world's #1 polluter. But with that, the government also continues to pour thousands of dollars into the NTF-LCAC, which is the National Task Force to End Local Communist and Armed Conflict, and COINTEL programs to suppress this movement towards national democracy. Activists are terror tagged in the Philippines, and even here in the US, my organization is terror tagged. And so as every day, while thousands of Filipinos are being forced to work overseas in order to support their families, engage in backbreaking farming in the countryside, we are continuously resisting. Yeah, and with that here, at PSU, we are waging a campaign called PSU Ties with Boeing, which PSU has this neoliberal partnership with Boeing to funnel students into internships like the global supply chain management, which only contributes back and reinforces the warmongering that's happening. Boeing not only creates airplanes, they also create a lot of weapons that's used abroad, in the first place to displace people from the countries of Palestine in the Philippines, right? And so PSU needs to prioritize reallocating resources and their partnerships and cut ties with Boeing. So just wanted to plug that in.
All right.
An applause for all of our speakers again. Great. So you see, that's what we meant when we were introducing this and saying, when we started talking, look at just how many common threads there are between these movements here. For the first part, starting with all the history we learned, starting with European imperialism, whether it was Spanish or British, and then all kind of giving off to this shared successor imperialism of the United States, which, supposedly our country, with our tax dollars in our name, saying, oh yeah, we're in solidarity with the people of Cuba. And so we will, again, quote unquote, from President Kennedy, starve them and try to overthrow their government. Or we're in solidarity with the people of Israel, but not acknowledging that the entire occupation state of Israel exists on stolen Palestinian land. Or we're in solidarity with the people of the Philippines, so we're going to send all of our military bases there and pretend and say we're going to defend them from a big, scary country like China, without acknowledging all of the ways that U.S. military presence is actually hurting the people there. So this is the kind of solidarity that the United States says it has. But the question is, what does solidarity actually look like between people? So we are going to move into question and answer now. We're going to see if there's any questions from the audience. But before we do, there's a couple other questions to give to the panelists. So just maybe like a 2-minute answer each. And the first is, how would you and your organization define international solidarity? So we'll just go down the table.
Okay, so for our organization, solidarity for people living here in the United States with the people of Cuba would be opposing the U.S.'s policy towards Cuba. That looks like taking Cuba off of the state sponsors of terrorism list, ending the blockade on Cuba, like listening to the United Nations vote that's condemned it for the last 29 years. It looks like just letting Cuba live and breathe. And there are a lot of different political ideologies that appear amongst people who all agree with this basic thing that U.S. just needs to take its hands off of Cuba. Some people are really into what the Cuban government's doing, some people aren't, but everyone who agrees with the hands off Cuba is just saying, like, let Cuba do its thing. The U.S. does not have helpful international policy. It's not solidarity, it's like parasitism, it's torture, it's murder in a lot of cases. Like, that's absolutely what's happening when you're cutting off like lifelines of medicine, food supplies, and the rest of it. So solidarity looks like opposing the U.S. trying to take down the empire.
Yeah, so for our organization, and I guess like how I define international solidarity is, I mean, we kind of all talked about it here, but like our common enemy here is the U.S. and it's propping up of either blockades to prevent our countries and our people from being able to like properly thrive, or installing puppet governments, or installing puppet puppet regimes, puppet states, to prevent our people from being to self-determine our own lives, to have sovereignty, independence, and true freedom. So, I guess international solidarity, like when I look at Cuba and the Philippines, is really because like I don't sympathize with their struggles, I empathize. It's because their struggle is very much mine, and the collective freedoms that we're going to win in the future has to be based on all of us being free. The only way we are going to be free is the end of US imperialism, because that is what's popping up, it's funding, it is training our oppressors. International solidarity within the U.S., the kind of list of items I looked at of Sorry, I'm just ADHD, guys. That list of items of just like that continuous land theft, the training of occupation forces and the weapons they get. It's a whole subject and item you can go into, but Israel is considered the #1 leader in the cyber warfare, and that's for good reason. It's because Palestinians are their testing subjects, and the United States puts $3.6 billion of our taxes to use on Palestinians as testing subjects, to which then they use to better their own technologies to then later sell back to Israel. If you see, it's this continuous cycle of the U.S. using other people, other countries and lands as fields to experiment on, as people to experiment on. So international solidarity looks like within here, confronting our role, the fact that our money is being used to fund these oppressions, to fund the state of Israel, and demanding an end to the flow of our US tax dollars going towards this.
Supporting BDS.
Ditto. Yeah. What was the question? What's international solidarity?
Yeah.
Yeah. Ditto. And, I think it really comes down to really listening to people and really understanding, okay, what are the challenges, what are the needs, and giving them a solution, giving them an alternative. I think all over the world, we are seeing heightening exploitation and oppression, both here in the US, right? We see the teachers, the nurses strike, Starbucks, and at the same time, we see globally the people's movements and revolutions also heightening. And so I think with, what international solidarity means to me is that we have to listen to what's happening here locally on the ground, listening to what do the people want, and linking and raising that to what's happening on the global struggle, because our problems are not isolated and we all have one common enemy. I think just thinking about our problems are not in isolation, in that the way we achieve I'm gonna stop there. Sorry, I'm starting to zone out now.
We are the 4-person ADHD front of the room here. That actually, I think, leads into our second question here before we pass it off to the audience, which is going off of those definitions of international solidarity. What does this look like here on PSU campus? How can we build better international solidarity between different struggles around the world, but also connecting it in a way that really touches on how people are struggling right here on campus?
For Cuba solidarity, for us, it looks like we get together on Fridays and we have our club meetings, and we're focusing a lot on education, on external education, like things like this, and also internal self-education, so really getting to the bottom of what is propaganda, what is true, like what thread can we follow to get through all of this, because we're constantly miseducated in our classrooms by the people around us, by the government, it's crazy, you guys, y'all know you're here. For us it looks like educating ourselves and reaching out to other people, and it becomes really kind of clear and obvious what truth can be, or what we're all striving towards as people, and not just as capitalists or as governments, what we actually need and where we can come together. So joining a club like Cuba Solidarity, like Super, like Anakbayan, there are other orgs on campus too, and just talking to people and continuing self-education. There are a few events coming up, and maybe we'll talk about that more later too, but I can just really quickly plug, we have there's a national campaign to take Cuba off the state sponsors of terrorism list, and there's going to be a huge rally in DC coming in June, and there's going to be some Portland mobilization leading up to that too, so they're kind of bigger things we can be a part of in a coalition style as well. So just educating, talking to people, staying tuned in.
Yeah, I mean, kind of similar to for Super, what does it international solidarity look like at the PSU campus? It's being able to create spaces and conversations where we can actually, for example, talk about Palestine, but also talk about the links and raise them between the Philippines and Cuba. and see like where is it on campus that's actually directly harming our people and harming these struggles. And because we are students, we are community members of Portland, we have a direct say in being able to confront the college and say, we do not want you to contribute to the oppressions of our people. We do not want you to try to squash our struggles for independence, for self-determination. And so for us, Palestine, it looks like ending the Israeli occupation. And for us here living in the U.S., that looks like ending our $3.6 billion of our taxes that goes towards that. And that's through the boycott, divest, sanctions movement. Boycotting Israel, being able to divest from any companies that are benefiting from the occupation, and fighting for the trying to place anti-imperialist sanctions on the state of Israel. And on the college campuses, we can look at where is our colleges trying to send our students to work. Who are they partnering with? Who are they bringing on campus to purposely spread misinformation? And how can we confront that? And how can we bring people into the conversation so that they are empowered with knowledge to confront this false campaign to make it look like U.S. interests are in the interest of the people, which we clearly know after today, that is not true.
What's the question again? Oh, okay. What does international solidarity look like on PSU? I mean, oh man, I feel like I already said it, but okay. Well, I think if we want people to care about what's happening in the Philippines, in Palestine, in Cuba, we also have to care about what's happening here on campus and off campus, right? It's about identifying what are the youth and student issues on this campus. I already hear from students like getting help from financial aid. There's no resource there. They only have 4 financial aid counselors. Crazy. And we have a campus of 28,000 students. And we also have the issue of maybe it's hard to talk to your professors, right? Because most of them are part-time, they're adjunct. So they are working 2 or 3 jobs just to survive. So yeah, understanding these bread and butter issues that are happening here, the basic issues that are happening, and really trying to help people see the bigger picture, that these issues that happen here on the campus are not separated from the young worker, older working issues that's happening off campus, right? Like, again, I mentioned like Starbucks on our campus in the Urban Plaza, they are unionizing, which is amazing, and they are also students that are participating in that. And we know that a lot of the people on this campus are coming from different backgrounds. This is an access school, so we're open to a lot of students who are non-traditional, first generation, working backgrounds, right? So that's the thing we need to remember is that like, if we talk about the issues that's happening on campus, we can also talk about the issues that's happening off campus and connect them to the larger issue, the one common enemy that we have, which is capitalism, and at its highest stage, US imperialism. So yeah, I really think it's building a fucking movement on this campus. Yeah, building a movement to resist US-led war. Yes.
Fucking movement here now. Give another round of applause for the speakers. So now for the rest of tonight, we wanted to pass it off to y'all in the audience to raise some questions. So what we'll do is, if you have a question, please raise your hand. We're gonna please keep it to under 30 seconds. And then I will let you know on the mic when that time is getting up, and then we'll pass it to our speakers to answer. Okay. So I see there's a question in the back there. Yeah.